The title of the talk is Probabilistic Operator Learning, which I think is a slightly different take on operator learning than I think the talks that we have seen from yesterday has gone. In particular, so we'll kind of focus on the connections between operator learning and generative modeling in sort of the kind of the fake image generation sense, and see how the tools from generative modeling can help do UQ, uncertainty quantification, when making sort of kind of operating learning methods. Okay, so before we get into the details, just to acknowledge some collaborators on this work. So most of the computational work is done by Siting Liu, who was on the original sort of in-context operator learning operator network paper, also with Stan, of course, as well. And our other collaborator, Marcos Katsoulakis at UMass Amherst and various funding agencies. Okay. So before sort of going into operator learning specifically, I would just sort of like to describe like kind of some of these aspects we sort of described yesterday. Basically, why should we think about sort of numerical analysis or traditional methods, like traditional computational methods over machine learning, right? So basically, so here's how I think about it. So there's like an establishment of sorts, I would say. Basically, why do we trust computational methods? Why do we trust applied and computational math and statistics for science and engineering problems, right? And as we've seen in many talks over all the talks before this talk, it provides like a very principled way of providing solutions to problems in science and engineering, right? It provides, because it's very principled, you can interpret it with really traditional sort of math analysis, so you can get sort of error bounds as well. And because of that, this leads to, just engenders trust, right? This is why we trust computational methods to address our scientific problems, right? But now it is being sort of slowly usurped in some way, right, by an insurgent, machine learning, right? So, okay, if it's an insurgent that's not principled, why is it so, why do we care in some sense? And it's basically just, I mean, at least my very crude cartoonish understanding, it would be to say, it has demonstrated empirical success in sort of high-dimensional problems, so or has the potential to do so at least, right? Generative machine learning has empirically shown to be successful in certain high-dimensional problems, so we can sort of say the solutions provided by machine learning are sort of scalable for really difficult science and engineering problems. So what we want to do is to say, okay, how do you merge these two, right? So in a general sense, right? So again, machine learning provides scalable solutions, traditional mathematics, principled methodology. And the idea is that, well, if you could somehow just lay foundations, right? Lay the foundations for, mathematical foundations for generative machine learning, then you sort of get both, right? That's the ideal situation. And the idea is to kind of close the loop in some sense, and you want to ground sort of scientific machine learning sort of tools in foundational mathematical principles. Okay, so maybe this is not super like enlightening for, you know, I think at some level everyone thinks this way in this room because we like math. I mean, machine learning is there, but we appreciate the success, but we like to understand what's going on basically, right? And so today we're just going to kind of view one instantiation of this sort of thing, right? So it's basically principled in-context operator learning. And so I'll just give you sort of the one-line sort of thing. What is in-context learning in a principled way? The argument I'll make is basically it really comes down to, oops. Let's do that thing again. It really comes down to this numerical methods, of course, and in particular, I'll just show you how Bayesian inference provides the right perspective to understand in-context operator learning. So we have seen many talks about sort of multitask operator learners and in-context operator learning, and it can solve many different types of ODE and PDE problems. But why is it able to do so mathematically? And my answer is, or at least the answer I hope to convey, is that it is doing Bayesian inference in the end. Okay. All right. So just to kind of let's just kind of review sort of. I would say, Hayden Schaefer talked about this yesterday, the comparison between sort of, I would just describe as traditional operator learning versus in-context operator learning. So a lot of this understanding that I have here is sort of from this paper, Operator Learning Algorithm Analysis from Nick Kovacsky. And so this is the standard information flow of traditional operator learning, right? Or at least how I understand it, okay? So there are three characters usually. There are parameters, there are conditions, and there are quantities of interest, right? So usually you might think of it as parameters are like parameters of a certain differential operator, for example, right? And then so in a different, sort of, this is sort of like a very crude abstract version of a boundary value problem, right? You have operators in the domain, operators operating on the boundary of the domain. These might be parameterized by parameters. You have boundary conditions, y, on the boundaries, right? And from there, you have a quantity of interest. Okay, so I know it's basically just a solution, but you'll see why I have to call this a quantity of interest, z here, okay? And so, based on this very abstract thing, then you can sort of say there are many specific problems that sort of fit into this sort of characterization, right? Why is it doing that? Okay. So let's just say, for example, initial value problems, right? So initial value problems are the case where the solution, so you might have that the dynamical system is parameterized by parameters, right? You have an initial condition y, and you care about the quantity of interest here is, of course, the solution of the initial value problem, right? But of course, so this is just a very particular instantiation of the boundary value problem. In this case, you have parameters that might be like sort of a coefficient field in your elliptic PDE or a source term, for example, and the conditions are, again, boundary conditions, and the solution is the quantity of interest we care about. This is why I don't want to call the quantity of interest a solution, because sometimes you might have inverse problems, right? In which case, the thing that you really kind of care about, the quantity of interest in the end, is not the solution, but rather it is the boundary condition, right? So here's a case where you might be given the solution y, right? So the condition is now the solution, right? And the parameters still like alpha 1, but the thing we care about is the boundary data. So that's a sort of an inverse problem, in which case the quantity of interest is not necessarily the solution, it's boundary data, okay? Okay, so in the traditional sort of like the standard information flow of traditional operator learning, this is what one might do in effect, right? We're given sort of just lots of training data of various sort of parameters of some family of differential equations, various initial conditions, boundary conditions, and the corresponding solution. And the idea is that, okay, we're going to fix a model, right? Some sort of neural operator, right? FNO, DeepNet, doesn't matter, right? It's just, you can choose your own thing, right? And then what happens is that you train, right? So how do you train this, right? So you train this by minimizing usually like a least squares objective, right? You just say, well, you just want to see your model is going to make with a certain parameter is going to make some prediction based on given the inputs of the condition and the parameter, and you want to compare the difference between that and the true solution zi, and you find the theta, the parameters of the model until you get something that's reasonably good in the end, right? So nothing new, right? I think to some extent we're all familiar with this sort of information flow, okay? If you have any questions, please just say things, okay? So how does it differ from in-context operator learning? So the information flow, in general sense for ICON, sort of induces this learning of, it's what kind of hand-wavy, in a hand-wavy way, we say we have to want to learn context, right? Whatever that means. So again, it's the same cast of characters, right? Parameters, conditions, quantities of interest, and of course it goes into this, that play into this sort of, in this abstract differential equation sort of formulation. Okay, so, but here's where it gets a little different, right? So in context operator learning, you're given a bunch of training data, but before you do any training, you just rearrange the training data a little bit. So you rearrange it so that all the sort of the conditions and the quantities of interest that correspond with the same parameter are grouped together, okay? Because during training in context learning, we do not have access to the parameters, right? So in fact, the training data omits alpha, right? So then you have groups of conditions and QOI training data that corresponds with the same parameter, but it's sort of just thrown away, right? And why do you do that? Because you want to sort of say, learn the context kind of amongst themselves, right? To figure out what the alpha is at the end. Okay, so this is the in-context operator net in a very simplified version, right? It is a mapping that takes in two things, right? First, it takes in sort of the example training data, right? Example pairs of conditions and quantities of interest, right? And this thing here defines what we say is context. These example condition QI pairs is the thing that informs context. And once it knows the context, then it knows how to map some new query or new sort of condition to a prediction. Okay? So this is my really simplified understanding of in-context learning. Okay? Okay. So then how do you train this? Typically, of course, we just say train it, but what does training really mean? It really means there's some sort of a minimization of some sort of mean squared error in the end, right? But you have to be very careful. You should see there are n, rather than there's n training data, there's actually n groups of training data. You're trying to make the in-context operator network learn context from these example condition QI pairs. All right. Okay. Cool. All right. So. Okay, so crucially, note that the training does not involve alpha, right? Just to kind of re-emphasize that a little bit. Okay, so, and this is what the paper in context operator learning with data prompts for differential equations by all the people, actually, Liu Yang is not in the room. So, like, many people are in the room, like Siting is in the room, Ting Wei, and of course, Stan, of course. And here's what they did, right? So they took a lot of differential equations with a lot of differential equations, each with their own parameters, conditions, and quantities of interest. And they use a transformer to basically to train a transformer based on this training data, so that the idea is that you'll get something, so you'll get something like, given lots of examples of sort of these are condition QI pairs. This is one of them, this is another one. And based on all this defines context, and then the idea is that you have a new question or basically a new condition, it gets mapped up with the prediction, and you do that over and over again so that it learns the context as well as how to solve the corresponding differential equation. And of course, then when at inference stage, the idea is that if you're given these pairs of condition QI pairs, and a new question, it could sort of answer or solve the differential equation without any extra training. Right? So it's purely just a mapping in this case. There's no extra training involved. Okay. So at least when we sort of started this project, we sort of looked at this paper and we were just kind of thinking, like, what exactly is in-context learning, right? Like, kind of what is the fundamental math problem that it's solving? That was the sort of the question that was just sort of mysterious for a long time, and it was one of the main goals of this of this work, right? What is ICON, right? What is it exactly, right? So how we're going to do it is, so we're going to describe, so we're going to answer this question in this talk, right? So first we'll describe what are the tools that we will use to approach this problem, and as the title suggested, probabilistic operator learning. So we lean into the probability aspect of operator learning, in fact, right? So first, we'll understand operator learning in a probabilistic perspective, in particular, sort of just through the tools of random differential equations. Okay, so that's our first stop. We'll describe operator learning in the context of random differential equations first. Okay, and from there, once you have that, then the thing is like, okay, I don't know why this is. What exactly is in-context learning? Again, we'll ask this question again in the context of the probabilistic formulation. And the answer we'll give you is in-context operator learning is implicitly performing Bayesian inference in the end, right? So the ICON is sort of like a Bayesian inference machine. That's what we'll kind of see in the end. Okay? Okay, you might say like, okay, great. Why should I care about being a Bayesian? What does the Bayesian interpretation provide us? So the last part we'll describe is there's a motivated way of describing a generative modeling formulation of ICON. And if you do that, it provides a way for doing uncertainty quantification, which is a way to provide a sense of confidence that the predictions basically your operator, your sort of surrogate model is making is trustworthy or not. Right? It'll give you some sense of like a confidence interval or like a band of how confident your learned operator is good at making predictions in the end. All right, any questions on the goals here? Okay, so here's the probabilistic formulation of operator learning. It really comes down to this idea of random differential equations as a way to describe the data generating process, right? And the key idea is just to say this. The parameters, the conditions, and the quantities of interest, they're all just random variables. They're coupled in some way, okay? So in the usual probability way, okay, you fix some probability space, right? And the idea is that when you're doing the when you think about training data, where does it really come from? It really comes from like you have all these different families of differential equations with different, and you generate a bunch of conditions, and you solve the differential equation on a bunch of on a bunch of those conditions and on a bunch of parameters, and that's how you create the training data, right? From probabilistically, how do you actually do it? It really comes down to these are random variables. You're modeling these sort of families or these collections of ODEs and PDEs as basically sort of you're modeling as like basically as random variables in the end, right? So here's a really kind of precise case or a concrete example of a random ODE, right? So you might have a family of this is a relatively simple random ODE, in which case you would probably, in which case you would generate many sort of coefficients and many initial conditions, and then solve for that corresponding differential equation. That's how you create the data, right? But what you are really doing is you're sampling from these random variables in the end, where you're kind of simulating these random variables from their distributions, right? So which means when you define a random differential equation, what you're really doing is this random differential equation induces a probability measure that describes how the data was produced, right? So in this case, you have some sort of probability measure Q, like on the parameters, the conditions, and the quantities of interest. And so basically the idea of like, where does this training data come from? It comes from samples of this probability distribution, right? Okay, now in practice, what does this actually look like? In practice, you have to solve these things, you actually have to discretize, right? And when you discretize, it really is like, okay, the parameters are just, they're scalars in this case. The condition is also a scalar. And then the solution is not a function, but it's kind of, in this case, it's a finite difference scheme, which means it's just a very long vector. But then there's a very interesting sort of graph structure within this probability distribution, right? Because the idea is that how do you know the solution at a future time given your solution at the current time, right? It's basically some sort of like, there's a probability transition kernel inside of here, conditioned on the fact you know the current position and then the parameter as well, right? Okay, but basic idea is, the important thing is that there is a probability measure that actually describes where the data is generated from. Okay. So based on this, we want to ask the question, okay, first we'll look at traditional operator learning. What is that in the context of this, this probabilistic formulation, and what is icon as well? So just to remind you of this sort of like from your kind of probability and statistics 100 class, right? The connection between least squares regression and something called conditional expectation, right? This is something you probably all seen, maybe you've forgotten, right? So just just a general sort of result, if you have x and y be random variables with some joint distribution, and let's just say you have built a model or a predictor, h of x, to be a predictor for y, then the predictor that sort of minimizes the mean squared error is the conditional expectation of y given x, right? So based on this, what is traditional operator learning then? What does this mean for traditional operator learning? So again, you have parameters, conditions, solutions coming from some sort of probability measure. And you have an objective that minimizes some least squares objective, basically, right? And the optimal one, or basically what is this doing? What is traditional operator doing from a probabilistic perspective is simply approximating a conditional expectation of the solution given the parameter and the initial condition. Okay? So that's sort of like the best thing you could do from a sort of statistical and probabilistic perspective. Okay? So this may not be super surprising, sort of like you're like, okay, yeah, sure, that's just how regression works, right? But now here's a really interesting thing. What happens when you apply this to icon or to in-context operator networks? Okay? Oh, so any questions on this slide before I move on? It's a very important slide. Conditional expectation. Least squares regression approximates conditional expectation. Just remember that, right? So now we want to do a version of this for icon. So here's the thing about icon, right? So you have to remember the first step was to, given this training data, which comes from the same probability measure, right? You're not doing anything special to them, you're just grouping them according to the same parameter, and then you throw the parameter away because you want it to learn context, right? So the idea of there's an interesting graph structure, which I kind of threw up here for icon. So how does in-context learning work from this picture, right? Because you have a new question, you're trying to make, you have a bunch of like examples of condition QI, you have a new condition, basically, you want to make a prediction. How does this information propagate? It propagates by saying, you're taking this data, right? How does this inform the question? Is by it's saying, we all have a shared parameter, right? And then from that information, it gets passed on to the prediction in the end, right? So this training data then is not actually, it's very subtle. It's not actually from the, okay, so of course, individually, they're from the same probability measure, but in practice, it's very subtle. These are, because the fact that these grouping, like kind of these ordered pairs of conditions and QIs within each J, they are not IID samples anymore. They are actually correlated, right? So it's a very subtle way of, so basically I'm saying like this is very subtly non-IID with respect to this distribution, right? In fact, you have to view these as groups of sort of example QI pairs that's coming from this joint distribution instead. Okay, and what is this joint distribution? The joint distribution of condition QI pairs. Okay, it's a very just complicated way of saying like, okay, you have to sample, you have the first condition on an alpha, like they all come from the same alpha, right, same parameter, and then you generate your collection of J examples of conditions and QOIs, and then you have to marginalize out over all the parameters in the end. So this is actually the measure that's generating the data for in-context operator learning. Okay? Okay, now you might say, like, why does this matter? Because remember, in the end, how do you actually train icon? You train icon with a least squares objective. And as we said, if you do least squares minimization, you're approximating some conditional expectation. So the question is, what is the conditional expectation icon approximating, right? And the answer is, okay, so I'm just going to write it down. If you've never seen it before, you're just like, this is just another probability distribution among many probability distributions on the slides, right? Here's a conditional measure of the prediction conditioned on a new query and example condition QOI pairs. And you're like, what the hell is this, right? So the answer is, there is a name for this already. It's called the posterior predictive distribution that comes from Bayesian inference, okay? And so when what icon is approximating, because it's approximate conditional expectation, icon approximates a conditional expectation known as the expectation of the posterior predictive distribution. Okay, if you know Bayesian inference, you're just like, wow, this is great, right? If you don't know anything about Bayesian inference, then you're probably like, this is no different from the previous stuff. Like, it doesn't have any meaning for now. So I'll do a small sort of detour into Bayesian inference just to recap of like, basically how does Bayesian inference solve the problem icon solves? Okay, so what is the posterior predictive distribution? That's the question I'll answer, okay? So basically, how does a classical Bayesian person approach the icon problem? So remember, here's basically the task, right? We have some model. Again, let's just keep it simple, some sort of simple one-dimensional ODE. And the idea is that, well, given example, like kind of this training, this data, right, of initial conditions and the solution, like J of them, right? They all come from the same alpha, so they all solve the same differential equation, right? And a new initial condition, can you figure out how to predict the solution of the differential equation that all this training data actually solves, right? So how would the Bayesian approach? First step is do Bayesian parameter estimation. So also known as kind of computing the posterior distribution. So the idea is that you want to characterize the probability distribution of the parameter conditioned on the data, right? So learn the parameter for the ODE given the data first, which, okay, so how do you do it? You do it by Bayes' rule, which in which case you do something called the posterior distribution of the sort of the knowledge you have about the parameter condition after seeing the data is proportional to some sort of prior knowledge you have about the parameters multiplied by the likelihood, so the probability of seeing the data condition on the parameter that you're looking at. Okay? So first you have to characterize this, right? This is how a classical Bayesian person would approach this. First you characterize the posterior, and then after you find the posterior, you want to make predictions, right? Because you're not done after you find the alpha. You want to actually make new predictions of what the new solutions are. So then you have to compute something called the posterior predictive, right? The predictions under sort of an inferred f, right? So again, so all I'm doing here is this is the posterior predictive that I put up before, right? And how do you find it? You have to take an alpha from the posterior distribution and make some initial and your sort of your new initial condition, and it will give you a prediction. But then because you don't know for sure what the alpha is, it's a distribution of possible parameters, you have to then integrate according to the posterior. Right? So it then gives you sort of a distribution of possible solutions, not just a single solution in regular operating, but a set of possible solutions. Right? Okay, so this is just Bayesian inference, right? Okay. So we'll come back. So what is that? So what is ICON doing? So again, so just to compare the two approaches side by side, task is given yj, zj pairs and a new sort of yj new condition, predict the solution, right? And here's the classical Bayesian approach. It's complicated looking, right? Compute the posterior distribution and compute the posterior predictive, and then take the mean of the posterior predictive to get this conditional expectation. Very cumbersome, right? But then, so basically, this two or three step process, ICON just sort of does it, like it just does it, right? It just kind of directly goes for it. Like it just goes from data to like this conditional expectation in one giant step, in effect, right? This is what ICON is doing in the end. Okay, so to be fair, like the interpretation of in-context learning as Bayesian inference, we're not the first ones to claim that. So there was this paper called An Explanation of In-Context Learning as Implicit Bayesian Inference from a few years back. But in that case, they were looking at like large language models, but in which case, does it mean to have a parameter or context of a large language model? It's a little more vague notion. But for differential equations, it's very clear, right? What is a parameter? It's the operator that you're kind of looking at, right? What is the condition? Oh, it's just the initial or boundary value conditions. What is this? What is a QOI? It's a solution, right? Or you want to do inverse problems, just flip it around. Okay. So we'll do some examples. So first is this reaction diffusion equation. Okay. So I'll just say to be particular. Okay. So the parameters are there's a reaction. So here's the reaction term. There's a coefficient field, right? And that's the parameter of this problem that we're going to feed into ICON, right? The conditions are going to be these numbers, this constant here, this source term, and these boundary conditions. And the QOI is not the solution, it's the solution plus some noise. Okay, so you're actually giving it bad information. You're not giving it the true solution here, right? So here's just an observation. So the example here is to show that ICON is doing something that traditional operator learning cannot explain very well in the end, I would say, right? So just crucially note, we're going to look at noisy observations, but for now, just consider this example, right? So here's the data generating process. You have the coefficient field to be some Gaussian process. You have the boundary conditions, the source term, et cetera, sampled randomly. And so here are some examples. So this is a noise. Okay, just to be clear, this is a noiseless case for now. We're just going to consider this case just to show the kind of the how it will act under no noise, right? So first note that there are 5 example condition QI pairs. So I didn't plot the conditions because they're just numbers. They're not really important. But over here, all these colored dots here are example solutions, right? So you can see purple is one example solution, orange is another one. And you can see green and red here, right? And crucially here is that, and then here is the idea that there's the truth that we're trying to replicate in the plus, right? And the red is the prediction that's made by ICON in the end. Okay? So crucially here, very interestingly, if you can really stare at it a little bit, is that we're not actually giving ICON the full solution. There are patches of missing parts of the solution, which is something that's not usually done in operator learning. And I would say it's probably not exactly clear how you would do that, but ICON is somehow able to still, despite the fact you're given partial observations of the solution, it can still learn the context and it can properly, and it can still provide a pretty good approximation of, I mean it's basically on top of each other, right, in the bottom plot over here, right? So here's an observation that we have that, based on this example, ICON is somehow able to learn from partial observations, which is sort of an interesting phenomenon, right? Now, the next case, I'm going to choose the same example, but now we're going to have noise in the example data, right? So here's a case, same problem. I'm going to turn up the noise a bit, and you can see the example solutions now have noise in them, on top of the fact that it's partial observations, right? Otherwise, it's the same thing, right? But now you can see that what is happening when you do prediction. So in black is what, like in the training data, this is how black appears, right? It's very noisy in the end. But when you evaluate ICON after you train it, it produces a smooth version, right? A smoothed out version, which is actually closer to the true solution from the previous slide. So what that means is ICON is actually denoising somehow, right? So this is nothing new. So these are just like, we just took the regular old ICON from the original paper and just did these experiments with noise and partial observations, and ICON still does incredibly well. And we want to answer how does it do that, and the answer is basically just comes down to the fact that you're doing Bayesian inference in there, right? In Bayesian inference, it is very well defined what does it mean to learn from partial observations, right? You can infer the parameter of your differential equations from partial observations, partial noisy observations, right? And because after you characterize the posterior and then the posterior predictive, then you compute a conditional expectation, you can get a solution, right? So now the question is, how does ICON denoise from everything? Well, remember, it's a conditional expectation, right? So you're actually getting the conditional expectation of Z, the noisy, the solution plus some noise. And if you just write this out, there's a very kind of a janky sort of computation, right? I'm just writing out Z is equal to U plus epsilon, right? Epsilon means 0. Epsilon goes away. So what does that mean? We get the solution back without any noise, right? So it's all explained, again, so this notion of sort of partial observations and ICONs being observed to denoise, all explained by probability in the end. Okay. So I don't have too much time left, but so I wanted to describe one last thing. Okay, the last part, which is now, up to this point, is just basically about what is ICON in the Bayesian perspective, and we said it's the conditional, the mean of the posterior predictive. So actually, the question could be, can you sample from the posterior predictive? Okay, and it is we can do it, right? And it basically just comes down to generative modeling, right? So remember, just to a quick recap of generative modeling, given data from some unknown distribution, produce more samples from that distribution, right? Typically, what you do is take a source distribution that's easy to simulate from, and somehow learn a transfer map such that so this map G push forward of the source distribution is approximately the target distribution, so that you can just sort of sample from the reference and then map it through the generative map, right? So standard generative modeling. Okay, so you could do this for the posterior predictive in this case, right? Can we sample from the posterior predictive? Yes, you can. What we call a generative ICON is able to produce samples from the posterior predictive. Same idea. Let PX be a reference distribution. A generative ICON is a mapping, right? Rather than going from the context and your new question to a specific one solution, it's going to you're going to push forward your reference distribution, and it's going to sample from the posterior predictive. Okay, so in the same sense, sample from the reference, map it through with the new condition and the sort of the example pairs, and you'll get a sample from the posterior predictive. Okay, so we'll see this in action in the next example. But here's one little interesting thing. What is the connection between the original ICON and the generative ICON? The conditional expectation. Original ICON is a conditional expectation, so it is just the average generative icon in the end. So the idea is that your original icon up here is just sort of like you just average over all the reference distribution of all these different operators that's sort of parameterized by your reference distribution, and it will give you the original icon back. That's the relationship. Okay, so that's just a recap. This is just to kind of compare in one slide. Original icon approximates the mean of the posterior predictive. Generative icon generates from the posterior predictive. And the idea is that the connection, the average generative icon operator is actually the original icon operator. Right, so what does this give you then is original icon would do something like this, right? It would just give you a single solution that represents the conditional expectation of the solution conditioned on sort of the condition, a new condition and the examples. And the generative icon, okay, of course, the black curve is the mean. And the idea is these gray curves, this is just a cartoon, are going to be other possible sort of samples from this posterior predictive distribution. And based on these, you can just simulate a bunch of these trajectories. You can get some confidence bounds on the prediction of the sort of the mean prediction here. Right? So it's sort of reminiscent of like a Gaussian process. If you've ever seen Gaussian processes, it's very similar in the end. Right? Okay, and just to be clear, this is a form of uncertainty quantification in the end. Okay, so here's a different example of. Actually, no, okay. I don't want to dwell on how do you do generative modeling too much, but if you want to know how we did it, we actually trained a GAN in the end because it has a nice operator sort of interpretation to it. So if you want to see the details, it basically just comes to minimize some sort of divergence between your like true samples from the true posterior predictive and the your model, right? And in the end, you can sort of discretize this with samples in the end and train the generator, the icon generator, in sort of a sort of a GAN's way, right? There's a min-max problem over here. But if you want to know more, we can talk later. Okay, but we did this for just a regular simple Poisson equation, right? So just to be clear. You have boundary conditions that are parameters, so those are unknown, right? You have conditions, which is just a source term. And the QOI is not the solution. It's the solution plus noise. Okay, so noise comes back here, right? Data generating process, okay, regular stuff. Gaussian, no, if it's a function, do a Gaussian process. Otherwise, do this just randomly sample from a uniform. And here are some examples, right? So the idea is that here are the conditions. So these are, again, so you notice that these are all partial observations. We never give it the full solution. It's always like patchy in some sense, right? And then here on the bottom, so all these little dots here, those are solutions, noisy solutions, basically, right? And we want to say, given this plus, right, can you predict the true plus solution in the end? Okay, so there are 3 example conditional pairs. Okay, the color lines are the example things. The truth is the plus, and so what we'll see is if you actually do the generative version of icon, you'll see that the black is the truth, the blue is the mean, so that's what like original icon would probably give you, and then these little dashed lines, those are sample trajectories, sample solutions in the end, and based on those sample solutions, you build this. Basically, like the first standard deviation and the second standard deviation around the mean here. Okay, so this is a way of doing uncertainty quantification. In this case, you would say this is a relative. This black curve is it's an okay solution approximation to the black. Right? Okay, so again, uncertainty bounds computed from generated samples from the posterior predictive. All right, so with that, again, just to conclude, takeaways, 3 main takeaways, just in 3 steps, right? The main message is icon is implicitly performing Bayesian inference for differential equations. How it's doing that is you first put it in a random differential equations framework, and then once you see it like that, icon is approximating the mean of the Bayesian posterior predictive, and if you make it generative, it does uncertainty quantification. So then naturally, so I didn't talk about like these other types of multitask operator learners like PROS and BCAT that were discussed yesterday, but perhaps provide some motivation to find more Bayesian structure in these multitask operator learners, because that's what they're kind of doing, I think, at a fundamental level. In which case, then they can not only just say like, oh, I have a solution, but you can also say I have a solution and I'm yay confident about the solution. And some stuff in the works. We're trying to figure out how to use other types of general models beyond GANs, but that's a work in progress. But yeah, thank you for listening.